So today I'm going to do my top 10 favourite books of all time. I found this really difficult to narrow down to 10 books actually. I love so many books and for so many different reasons. So I find it quite difficult to narrow it down to 10, and sometimes when I look at the list I'm contesting, oh, should that be higher or should that be lower, but that's only because I love the books sometimes in equal measure and sometimes in not so equal measure. But I managed to make a list of 10 of my favourite books, and without further ado, let's start. So number 10 is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and that is written by Anne Bronte. A lot of you'll be familiar will be familiar with the Bronte name, but maybe not so much Anne Bronte. It's actually quite a scandalous book, and when it was published first it caused a lot of controversy, but I think Anne Bronte kind of gets pushed to the side a little bit. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is in some ways just as sort of shocking and groundbreaking as Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Maybe not just as much, but I think as a standalone novel it is excellent. I mean, I would reread it again. It is not an overly long novel, but it is definitely worth a read. So I don't want to spoil anything in the novel, so I'll not go into any of the plot or anything like that, but definitely if you're in for an exciting plot, really interesting characters, and sort of you want to feel contested in how you feel about the characters at different times of the book. It really plays with your emotions and how you feel about the characters at certain times of the novel. And to me that's just a sign of a great author, if you can make somebody feel a certain way about a character up until the point where you want to change their opinion. Anne Bronte definitely did that very well. My number 9 choice is The Divine Comedy by Dante, or Dante Alighieri, I think I've pronounced that right. The Italian author really created something so inspirational and so groundbreaking. There are 3 sections to it, and put together they're all quite lengthy. You have got Inferno, Purgatory and Paradise. So Dante basically is taking his character of himself, which is Dante, through hell, and he is guided by Virgil. There is Purgatory and Paradise, but I think the section of Inferno is probably one of the better known out of the 3 and one of the most groundbreaking. I mean, it inspired paintings, drawings, different interpretations of what hell is and what heaven is, and it even inspired a video game not that long ago, a couple of years ago, and different animated films. So it really reached divine levels, I suppose. The descriptions of hell and the different sections that hell could be broken down into, you know, for anger, for violence, gluttony, lust, different things like that. And the fact that Dante used real characters that people would have known, for example Antony and Cleopatra, and really must have at the time spoke to people. I think when the book was published, or the poems were published first of all, I think there's the story that a lot of people went into a panic thinking that, oh my gosh, this is what will happen when I die. They almost took it as biblical, which it wasn't. It's fiction, but the fact that Dante went into so much effort to describe the different layers of hell, who could possibly be in them and why they would be there, I think must have caused a real stir at the time for people who maybe weren't as well educated as they could be, and people that wouldn't have had the education or I suppose what we would say the common sense today to think, well, this is just a man that has written this, he's not preordained or anything like that. But it most certainly is worth a read, no matter what translation you read. There are a lot of different translations. The simplest ones are nearly the best, because they just give you straight away what the language is, what Dante is saying, and what is happening in the belly of hell, I suppose. Okay, so my number 8 choice, I would have liked to have put it up the list, but in comparison with the other books, it is my number 8 choice, and that is Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Not only is it a good book, there is a good BBC adaptation of it, I think. It's a plot line that I think speaks to, or could speak to, any generation really. Basically, without spoiling anything, it is about a woman who has these ideals and these desires, and she puts things up on pedestals, and she puts people up on pedestals, and even herself in many ways puts herself up on a pedestal and expects her life to be a certain way. And when of course these expectations aren't met, the consequences of this are what plays into the difficulties that come within the book. And Flaubert is just an excellent, he's very quotable. There are a lot of quotes within Madame Bovary that are just great. Okay, so my number 7 choice as well, I find this quite difficult to put on the list because I do really love it, but again, in comparison with some of the other texts, I chose it as my number 7, and that is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And anybody that knows me knows how much I love Oscar Wilde, and how much of my bookshelf is filled with Oscar Wilde plays, books, biographies, different things like that. But The Picture of Dorian Gray, I think, is just, it's so adaptable to modern society, to any kind of society. Although it's set in the Victorian era, you could totally apply it to any era really, because the character of Dorian, he's basically hiding his true nature from the world, and the book focuses a lot on the image of yourself versus your real self. How long can you keep up this persona? As a society, we're so obsessed with looks and with how people perceive us that we bury our flaws, whether they're physical or emotional. And Dorian Gray is an example of what happens when people are so determined to hide these flaws and to present a mask, and the consequences of this are what happened behind the mask, and eventually that you can't keep up this persona, you just have to be yourself, and if you don't, it isn't going to be good for you or for anybody around you. Okay, so interestingly for my number 6 choice, I have chosen Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I know that I had said earlier that Anne Bronte was just as good, if not better, in some ways, but I will admit that reading Jane Eyre when I was 17 growing up, doing my English literature A-levels, it wasn't part of the curriculum or anything like that at the time, but it's just a book that speaks to me, I suppose, because Jane is such a strong character, really inspirational, even though when she's set with these sort of temptations in front of her, again I don't want to spoil anything, but Jane she's given these temptations, and despite that being what she wants, she has these set of morals that she will not break. And I think that is something that boy, girl, man, woman, male, female, doesn't matter. I think anyone who reads Jane Eyre can aspire to be as strong-willed as Jane is, and to go through as much difficulties as she does, and to come out on top. So on to my number 5 choice, and this is a book that just, I found it difficult to place as well actually, because in some ways I could have put it higher up on the list, but I managed to find a place for it. And my number 5 choice is 1984 by George Orwell. I think a lot of people will be aware of this book, whether or not through pop culture, and of course even Big Brother really is something that came from 1984. It is a book that I think again is very relevant today. 1984 I think is a staple for anyone who is interested in any kind of literature. 1984 is a book that makes you question what reality is, I suppose, in some ways. What would you do when faced in this situation? Would you again, I don't want to spoil anything, would you fight the system or would you break? And it is a book that had me in floods by the end of it, and it was suggested to me by a friend, and I'm so glad that I took the time to read it. It's not a massively lengthy novel, but it doesn't matter because you get so invested in the characters and so worried about them in a lot of ways that it just takes you right on through to the end. And I was a mess by the end of it, just tears everywhere. So if you want to be stressed and emotionally moved and in floods of tears like I was at the end, definitely give 1984 a read. It's one of those books that you come away feeling, you know, glad that you've read the book, but maybe a little more cynical about the world. My number 4 choice, in some ways maybe similar to the previous 1984, it is another sci-fi book. And it is another dystopian book, one that I have read quite recently, so I think that maybe tipped the scale in why it was just a bit higher than 1984. But my number 4 choice is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And again, it's just, whether or not you're into sci-fi or dystopian literature or not, it is definitely worth a read. And it is another book that at the end had me in tears, just because you get so invested in the characters. And there are quite a few characters in this book, and Huxley gives them all their own individual they're real characters. I mean, sometimes you read books and you think, that's not what somebody would say, or that's not how I think that character would react. When you really delve into the characters that Huxley gives you, they're just so deep and so human in a lot of ways. Although maybe we would connect with some of them more than others, we connect with them all on some level, even though it's set in a completely different world, completely different timeline. They're not that far removed from what we would be, from human nature really. And it is an exploration of human nature and how we as people deal with change and deal with the pressures of a really modern society, I suppose, in the book. And the ending is, yeah, it's an ending that I won't forget anytime soon, so definitely worth a read. My number 3 choice then, moving on, is The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Again, you can see a pattern here. It is sci-fi. More so than dystopian, it's sci-fi. But this is just a great thriller. The character of the Invisible Man as well, although he is unlikable in some ways, by the end of the book, I know I do anyway, I feel very sorry for him. And just the description of him in the very last pages of the book, it's just so pitiable, or so, I'm just filled with empathy for him in some ways. In the middle part of the book, you get disillusioned with the character of the Invisible Man, but by the time you get to the end of the novel, he's human. At the end of the day, he has flaws like everybody, and something that he tried to do went wrong. Not so far removed for any day person on the street, that we try to do things and they don't always work. And should we be hated for that? No, I don't think so. But The Invisible Man is a book that is very close to my heart. I studied it for my dissertation. It, along with Frankenstein, actually, I done the two of them in my dissertation. So The Invisible Man is a book that is very close to me, and I have a lot of time for it. I would read it, I try to read it once every couple of months, and I enjoy it every time. I find something new nearly every time, a new way of looking at some of the characters, a new way of looking at the scientific part of it and the humanizing part of it. So it is definitely worth a read, although it may not be as accessible as, say, 1984 or Brave New World. But if you're into H.G. Wells at all, or sci-fi, definitely, it's worth a read. So, moving on to my number 2 choice. So this was an easy one for me. I knew it was going to be at the top of the list when I started talking about my favourite books and thinking about what would go on the list. And that is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I remember reading this during my A-levels, and the first time I read it I thought, I don't get it. I don't get this book. I don't get what it's about. I don't get the characters. I don't like it. And then as I knew I was going to have to do it for an exam, you reread it more than once, and it's only 9 chapters. It's relatively short. You can read it in about an hour and a half, depending on how quick you read. But reading it a second time, I sort of thought, okay, I get what's happening a bit more. And then through reading and rereading it and understanding maybe a bit more about F. Scott Fitzgerald and the time period that he was in, the Roaring 20s, 1920s America, really. Flappers, Chippendale, different things like that. I really, really fell in love with the story, and writing essays about it was fun, dare I say. And for it being such a short book, I have the utmost admiration for Fitzgerald and how fleshed out the characters were, and how many symbols and images and themes and that he managed to fit into 9 chapters. I think for a book, if there's a book that you would need to read to give you inspiration to write, that is one of them. In relatively short chapters, 9 short chapters, F. Scott Fitzgerald takes you on this journey through 1920s America. Parties, flash cars, food, fashion, expensive clothes, expensive drinks, everything. And then by the end of it, all that frivolity is peeled back, and we're left with the real world and what happens when, again, expectations being too high and dishonesty and this sort of fakeness is all peeled back, and you're left with the real world. And you don't have to be interested in American literature or 1920s sort of style to not appreciate the book. It is very, very well written. And the newest film with Leonardo DiCaprio is very, very good, actually. When I went to the cinema to see it at first, I sort of thought, I don't know how they're going to be able to top the book, but they did it very well. And even if you're not interested in reading the book, watch the film, and the film might inspire you to pick up the book and to delve into it. So last and not least, my number 1 choice is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I've talked about Frankenstein before, obviously, and many of you know that I did Frankenstein for my dissertation, and just loved the book. The sci-fi aspect, the gothic aspect, the aspect of life and death, and how important life and death are, and that you shouldn't take life into your own hands. You can't make yourself God, and if you do, bad things are going to happen. And I think for today's society, with the different scientific advances and things like that, I think Frankenstein is maybe a cautionary tale of how poking around with life and trying to create life out of death, or create something completely askew from human life, is very dangerous. And I just love it. I could reread it and not have a problem with it. The language is just so beautiful, and it really takes you to the settings every time. The darkness, the pressure that Victor Frankenstein is under when the creature goes AWOL, the worry, the description of the creature itself, the yellow eyes, the pale skin, the thin skin barely covering the muscles and the tissue, and the description as well of when Victor destroys the creation of the female monster. I can just picture it in my head, him ripping these limbs apart from this creation, and it's gory and it's gothic, and it's no wonder that there have been that many film adaptations and TV adaptations that, although they do skew quite far sometimes from the source material, the crux of it is there, I suppose, the creature. But at the end of the day, I think importantly what the novel asks us is what is monstrous and what is human. And I think the creature blurs the lines because he's not a monster to start with, only because he looks like a monster. He had the capacity for love, and because he was rejected by humans, being made by humans and rejected by humans, that is when he gained the capacity to be monstrous and to be murderous. And I don't think that's too different from human nature. I think that if you let somebody be loved and treat them well, they're not going to react badly. Okay, so all in all, that was my top 10 favourite books and just a wee description of why I like them.